Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm sorry Peter's actually had to leave because I wanted to give him like a really shameless plug about the BRE Innovation Park. If you haven't been here before, it really is a wonderful place to wander around and have a look at the types of experiments that are undertaken here and sort of in real life and real time in the houses that are around us. So I had the privilege, I've been in the UK, and you'll guess in a minute, if you haven't already, you'll guess where I'm from in a minute. But I've been in the UK for nearly 10 years, and about 8 years ago, I was on this site, I had a hard hat on, but that was only for the photographs, but helping to build the Prince's natural house, which is just sort of behind us, a Georgian, which looked like a Georgian terrace. And it was really terrific at that time to be talking to people within the industry about natural building products. And I guess for me personally, as a son of a builder, it was lovely to come to a place like this and see sort of all the modern stuff and all the great gadgets and all the things that, you know, innovators are coming up with in terms of dealing with, you know, the future of building in this country. But also to see us thinking about partly how we used to build, what we'd learnt from that. And now in my new role, in sort of speaking about resilience, I think back on some of those types of lessons that we sort of learnt back 8 years ago about the use of natural products and the place they have alongside all the other stuff that we have available to us today in terms of building. And I think when we hear later from Mary, is Mary here yet? I haven't seen Mary. So Mary Donoghue will talk to us about some of those measures which do reflect on the use of some natural materials, which I think sometimes we forget. So can I encourage you to have a look at that a bit later and just think of me on the roof looking at the slate tiles and thinking, how can I convince the Prince of Wales that we need solar tiles on this roof that look like slates? 8 years ago, they weren't available on the market. Yesterday, I saw something on, I think it was on Facebook, that someone had posted from the States where they've now produced tiles that absolutely look exactly like slate tiles, but they're solar, they're photovoltaics. Like, it's absolutely fascinating. So in a very short space of time, that, you know, technology is giving us stuff that can allow us to create places that are beautiful, that reflect history, that make place. So I'd encourage you to think about that when you're going on. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about resilience, obviously because we're at Resilience16 conference, but what it sort of means to me, and what I've learnt in my sort of 25 odd year working history in terms of what resilience means, and some of that thinking and how I'm applying it in my current role. As Peter said, I was involved in the working groups that put together that report a few months ago, and it was great to bring some of the businesses together, but also the charity third sector together with industry and with government. It was a really interesting experiment, and I think we did quite well in the end. So I'll talk a little bit about one of the tasks that I was involved in. We had 5 task and finish groups, and the one that I was involved in was sort of funding bits, and how do we actually do stuff. So the practical action side, and I'll give a couple of examples that emerged from that group and what we took forward. I'll also, I will talk a little bit right at the end about some of my reflections on what some of the challenges have been in terms of those dreaded grants from the UK government. I shouldn't say dreaded grants, the wonderful grants that were made available that have been difficult to access. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So as Graham said, BRE is part of the Prince's Responsible Business Network, Business in the Community. And I head up that initiative, so think of it as a campaign. A number of companies, 20 odd companies, fund the campaign, trying to help small business owners and micro businesses sort of prepare, respond and recover from unanticipated events such as floods. It could be a cyber attack or something major that affects a large community. I think the idea is that businesses also have quite a significant role to play, obviously, in recovery efforts, but also in building resilience. So that's what BRE's about. So there's my punchline. So I was saying I'm from Australia, right? This is Brisbane. So this is actually the Brisbane floods, believe it or not. This is obviously a time lapse, which someone very cleverly set up over a number of days. But you'll see it's a really nice day in Brisbane, right? This is Brisbane in, I'm just thinking of the year it was a 2011, I think. Anyway, this was a number of days after the floods that had hit the north of the country in Queensland. And as I say, it looks like a relatively calm day. It was, the sun was out. But if you can see the flow of the river and the stuff coming down the river, boats couldn't actually navigate up this river on this day because many boats, you'll see this one will go off in a minute, jetties, bits of major infrastructure were being ripped off the side of the bank and from within the river and being taken down bank. Huge infrastructure impacts and damage. You will see a boat coming up there in a minute, going that way. It's a tugboat, really struggling, just to give you an indication of the strength of that flood. Probably the biggest damage to Brisbane at this flood, and the flood actually went into the city over a number of days and caused some significant damage to the downtown area. But the floods didn't only affect Brisbane, they affected 90 towns and 200,000 people. There were 20,000 homes in Brisbane flooded in this particular flood, 2.38 billion Australian dollars in damage, and it actually reduced Australia's GDP that year by 40 billion Australian dollars, 38,000 insurance claims, and 3/4 of the entire state was flooded. So it was affected. And just to give you some perspective, Queensland is 7 times the size of Great Britain. So just to give you a bit of a perspective there on it. You know, unfortunately, we also had 35 deaths, which, considering the extent of flooding, it wasn't as bad as one expected. The reason I wanted to show that was because, to me, the experience of that and the experience of something else I'll talk about in a minute still made me feel that resilience, even at that time, and we're going back quite a few years now, it's not really spoken about very much. What's usually spoken about is infrastructure and the damage to infrastructure and how do you improve infrastructure so it can cope better. There was also quite a bit of blame up the line. I've seen that here in the UK as well over the years. So it's not that unusual. And I think what Mary will talk about this afternoon, Mary Dono, and she's from the Property Care Association, that we need to focus as much on the resilience piece, but resilience is also about trying to help people understand their own risk. And Mary will, I'm hoping Mary will talk about that a little bit later. And there's a piece there around empathy, which Graham will pick up a bit later, which I think is really important to keep in mind because of the effects that we see, that impacts like these and other floods that we've seen have on people. And if I talk in climate terms, because my background is actually in climate change, and I worked for the federal government in Australia on climate change for about 10 years. Many years ago, in the early days when we described climate change as global warming, we spoke about adaptation. And in a sense, when I'm thinking about resilience now, I'm thinking, well, it's sort of adaptation, isn't it? Because we know that these events are going to keep happening. In Australia, we know the floods are going to keep happening, and as I'll talk about in a minute, other major disasters. So we have to learn to cope with them better because the impacts are going to be felt for a lot longer, a lot past our lifetime anyway. Okay, I'll move on from that. This goes on for a while, but an interesting one. So, more personal, because I'm actually not from Brisbane. If any of you are Australian, you'll pick that up from my accent. I'm from Canberra, where I spent most of my adult life. And resilience to fire was what I grew up with in Canberra, trying to understand how you cope with fire. So this image is actually not far from where I lived in Canberra 10 years ago. These fires, though, were 2003 fires. So, and in Australia, I guess, and again, it's not to say, we can sort of teach you a couple of things here in the UK, but when I grew up, we did speak about understanding that these, and this was a pretty amazing event, but these types of events are part of the sort of Australian psyche. I don't pick that up as much here in the UK in terms of people understanding we need to cope with these sorts of events now. So that's quite interesting. So Canberra fires, a couple of other quick facts about this. So it happened in January of 2003. The fires started from lightning strikes. Again, not that unusual. Big storms happen in Australia. And the fires that burned for about a week around Canberra, the nation's capital, came into the suburbs. So they crossed the containment lines, essentially. And 70% of the Australian Capital Territory was burnt. So that was pretty significant. So all the pastures, forests, nature parks were all severely damaged. We'd lost forests that had been around for 200 years, sort of thing, which was pretty incredible. And in only 10 hours, so 10 hours, I remember it because I remember standing on my roof looking at these fires. In 10 hours, 530 homes burnt to the ground. So it's pretty incredible. 490 people were injured, and we had four deaths as a result of that. The biggest thing I picked up when I reflect on the experience of the floods just at Christmas, New Year here, was that people still don't know what to do. Do I leave my home? Do I stay in my home? With the fires, we were told, leave. You've got to leave, because the fires have gone over the containment lines. The fire brigades can't get back quickly enough into town because they can't get back across through the fires, so you've got to leave. But there was nowhere to go. The only place you could really go is down to the lake. The lake, if everyone knows Canberra, there's a big lake, a man-made or artificial lake in the middle. But really, 320,000 people, it's a lot of people to get around that lake. So then the authorities said, no, actually, don't leave. So there were literally, people had packed their cars, were unpacking their cars again and going back inside because there was no way to get out of Canberra. So the advice then was, and we learnt this, it's always easier in hindsight as we're learning from the floods up north even more recently, it's always easier to reflect on these things afterwards. But those that stayed at home, most likely their homes didn't get affected or didn't burn to the ground. So you had literally a house burnt to the ground here because the people had left, house here didn't burn to the ground, didn't burn to the ground, house burnt to the ground. That was literally in our street what had happened. And so I think that building up better understanding of how to cope with these types of events is a message I think we really need to talk more about in the UK, whether it's flooding or as here with floods. So that's a bit of a personal reflection. I'm going to get this right this time. So as I think has already been discussed, BRE, and in the introductions, BRE really is a collaboration of businesses. So what we try and do within the Prince's Charity is, we're not a responder as an initiative. What we try and do is bring business together, usually in the aftermonths, so the many months after. So I too was talking to Paul earlier about some of the problems in Carlisle with still a number of micro businesses that just can't get on their feet. And there's a likelihood those businesses won't get on their feet. This is not unusual after big events. However, I think if we can be a little bit more clever in terms of response and bringing businesses together, we may be able to help more so with those businesses coming back together. So, and I think what I learnt from the exercise with the government report was bringing those interested parties together is really essential, and probably sooner rather than later after a major event. But the resilience piece, of course, is part of that sort of business continuity planning, be it what you would call it. But it's an understanding that we need to think about these events so that the recovery can be hastened. BRE, as I said, is a collaboration. You'll see the members there. Some a little bit more active than others, depending on the resilience measure we're trying to address. I'm going to give a couple of shameless plugs to Aviva, because Graham's been absolutely marvellous on the BRE leadership team in helping us bring not only the Aviva as the insurance company together, but like companies together who are genuinely interested in resilience. And it's been incredibly helpful, I think, to have the industry around that table trying to think about how we can respond more effectively and how we can build that resilience, particularly for small business owners, which obviously has a knock-on effect to the wider community. And the other group, which I'll talk about a little bit later, has been Adler and Allen, who have been helpful as a BRE member in quickly responding. And when I talk about some of the actions, I'll give you an example of the call for help, which BITC did to its membership of 850 odd companies. And one of those companies that came forward amongst many was Adler and Allen. So I think that, as I said, one of the things I'd like to focus on is what were some of the sort of immediate actions that we felt that we needed to undertake. And a lot of that was around the funding, of course. So if there was funding made available, and it's not always guaranteed that there will be funding made available after a major event such as a flood, but there was funding made available for storms Desmond and Ava, which is a very important distinction. But what could we do to help deliver those grants. Now, I think many of you in this room have probably heard or speak about the same sort of thing. Embarrassing, that's my phone. That sometimes these, sometimes it's difficult to understand why it's so hard to get these grants out. Why is the uptake so difficult? So we tried to unpick some of that, and I think we had some success in trying to understand this a little bit better and help next time. So of course, this is a photo of Kendall. We found that there was a call for some help. Happened to be when we launched out the working group that produced the report that Peter spoke about, and we know that much of Cumbria was affected by the flooding. There was 300 millimetres of rain in Cumbria. I'm sure others will talk about that today, exceeding all previous records. Several thousand homes inundated with water. Nearly 9 months later, still quite a number of people still not in their homes, which is extraordinary. But tens of thousands were without power for several days, and the knock-on effects of that within communities, and again, the emotional impact of that, let alone the financial and impacts, is quite extraordinary. And we saw, major infrastructure damage as well, similar to what I mentioned in Brisbane, that many bridges swept away or damaged, not able to be travelled over. So in Kendall, I remember going there not that long after the floods, and the traffic was just incredibly horrendous because people there was only one route in and out sort of thing, and that was really, really difficult for that town in that whole recovery. So we had £5 billion worth of damage as a result of those last floods, 1.3 billion worth of insurance costs. Sorry, you're probably going to mention this, Graham, but that's fine. So what we did as one of the groups that I was asked to do was to bring some of the companies that could help, either with surveying help, building help, set up shop in a place like Kendall so that people could access some information. Now you would think, well, isn't that the government's responsibility? Well, yes, the government was providing information, but people were so traumatised after these flood events. And again, from my personal experience, it's that trauma that needs to be dealt with immediately, and the medium term to longer term help that's needed. So the fact that we just set something up that was branded the Prince's Charity was really important, because it meant people could come and get information from that, from the charity. And whilst it was exactly the same information they were getting from the local authority, from other organisations in Kendall at the time, or from DEFRA or DCLG, I think having a charity there to give out that information was impactful. And that was also provided an opportunity for some of the technical advice to be given, some of the products that were available on the market to be discussed, that sort of thing. So that's what did I go there already? Can't remember. So there was a shop that was set up. This is just an example. So one of the actions and one of the challenges we gave Adler and Allen actually was to say, can you just set up a shop just to give out information? Originally, they'd set up in a car park in a trailer, then they kitted out a small bus which drove around, but we found that had mediocre sort of uptake, because again, I think there was issues with accessibility and that sort of thing, and visibility as well. So the local authority, South Lakelands, made available a unit that had been flooded, that had been cleaned out, right in the centre of town, and it's been helpful. There have still been challenges there, though, in terms of the uptake, but it has been helpful. So the aims of the task that I mentioned earlier, so I think it might have been even task 1, was to look at what the grant delivery options were, look at how we could cost effectively sort of deliver the measures that the grants were supposed to deliver. How could you link up the grants, for example, with insurance money, which is an example. Where is there practical help already available within local authority areas, within the areas affected by the flooding? Again, that was difficult because everyone was stretched. The local authority was stretched. Charities were stretched. So it was really hard, and because it was more than one place affected by the flooding, it was difficult to sort of get the number of surveyors you needed to do the work, that sort of thing. And so that's something which we tried to identify, whether we could draw on resources from the membership to help with that. And as I said, how can one set something up that delivers advice directly to the community so that there's a bit of confidence there that it's okay to apply for this grant or to try and think about different options of using the grant. And how do we promote it and make sure the uptake is better than 20%, which is what it's been. And historically, that's not different. I think we've had a little bit more of uptake of those grants, those resilience grants, but it's not fantastic, which is, I think, a real shame, So in the Kendall example, there were about 1,500 property owners that were given some assistance through this. So that's, again, as a pilot, it's not a permanent thing here. We were piloting this to see whether the model would work. We're still not sure whether it's something we would do again, but at the moment it seems like it's helping, or at least providing some support to some of the local authorities that are struggling. So there's been 700 odd grant applications that have been completed through this, and there's been some recognition, I think, more recognition now through this initiative that business has a role to play, that right across, that industry should be around those tables when we're discussing how you deal with these sorts of incidents. So, go the wrong way again. Now, a quick diversion. Storm Matthew, so that was very recent. I spoke about this at the Flood Expo not long ago. I guess the most recent global event, and I wanted to sort of put this slide in. I'd taken it out originally, I'll put it back in again, just to drive home the point that these events are going to be more frequent and more severe for the UK. And this example, and I wanted to put this example up just to sort of talk about climate change for a second. I think, again, many people in this room will know this stuff, but pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were 280 parts per million, and the level, and that was 280 parts per million, that's how you measure carbon in the atmosphere. That was the same level for about 10,000 years, okay? Now, I think, and sort of prior to that, 400,000 years, the levels were stable at about 180 parts per million. So it gives you some indication of what's happened in the last 100 or so years, where we've peaked now at 400 parts per million. And when I started working in climate change, we were talking about aiming to sort of 350 parts per million as probably being okay to cope with globally. So we could probably, the atmospheric system could probably cope, and we could probably start pulling back or live with 350 parts per million. 2016, very recently, we just saw it hit 400 parts per million, and pretty much the trajectory is it's not great. Anyway, so essentially means that the temperatures are going to warm globally, or have warmed globally by 2 degrees. We will see more, for our lifetime and probably our children's lifetime, we will see more storms, greater intensity, more extremes, and more floods in the UK. That's something we have to live with. So I guess in terms of resilience, we need to think and talk more about resilience as well as resistance measures. And again, I think that's part of the theme today. The other point to make, and it was driven home with this event in the Haiti flood, the storms that hit not long ago, that it's those that are least able to cope that are impacted the most. It's no different from what we see in the UK. So those communities that are most vulnerable, that have the fewest resources to be able to cope or to recover, are the ones usually that are impacted the most. So I think it's important for us to understand that, and when we talk a little bit later about empathy and why that's so important to and understanding that is important to recovery, we really need to talk about that. So this and as an example with this event, this international event, there were 14 people killed in the US as a result of this in Florida, but thousands and thousands of people killed in the Caribbean, and of course much of Haiti has been destroyed. So it just gives you a sense of the impact of this, but the impact particularly on vulnerable communities, which I think is really the point I wanted to make. How am I going for time? Probably completely over, am I? Okay. Quick summary slide. What we learnt from the work we did, and please, I encourage you to have a look at the report. It's really the beginning of the work, because we've got now a 12-month program of looking at other practical actions and other things like how do we work more closely with the insurance industry and with banks, etc., which I'm going to work with Graham on. But I think what we learnt was the partnerships are absolutely essential. Building and improving on regulations, absolutely essential to encourage resilient repairs. bringing the insurance and the banking sector together a little bit more to understand what flood resilience means and how we create a better system and mechanisms to encourage more flood resilience is absolutely essential. We'll speak today also about the importance of standards and we'll talk a bit later about more robust certification with support from right across the industry, which is really important, and the greater level of information that we're able to give. We've learnt from the floods, people want the information, they want help not only immediately when the flood happens but in the year after, and that's as important to the recovery, speeding up the recovery as ever. I will stop there because I know my time's run out. I'm happy to talk later. I'll be here all day, obviously. I had a couple of examples I was going to talk about. One was in Cockermouth, and it may be mentioned later today. Look it up. It's Jonty Chippendale from the toy shop in Cockermouth. He really has, and I've had the privilege of spending some time with Jonty in Cockermouth, just to try and understand what are the practical things that a small business owner really off his own back had done, because he knew and accepted that after the third time his shop got flooded, that if he didn't do something that was going to help him recover quickly, then he wouldn't be in business going forward. Really interesting case study, and you can Google toy shop in Cockermouth and you'll find the case study. The other one was the Reverend Johnny Gios, who I got to know in Kendall, and some of the things that he learnt in terms of tracking and working with the insurance industry and others, and with the local authority, to understand where the flood impacted in his local community, but really took action on the ground, as it were, with his community to help and build a better understanding of resilience is absolutely fascinating, and I take my hat off to that particular community for what they've done. But there are many examples of this, and I think what we need to be better at doing is talking about and exposing these examples of where communities have taken resilience to heart and really done something about it. So thank you. I'll stop talking now. Thank you very much. Sorry about the earlier technical hiccup. I'll hand back over to Graham.